Thank you for having me here. Thank you for being here. OMG, right? I have so much to tell you in the time that I have, so I'm going to go fast. But I think let me go through the battle for facts. This is it. And whether it's from Ukraine or Brazil or Kenya or Russia or every country around the world, this is the crucial problem. Let's talk about it. In the Nobel lecture, I talked about a person-to-person defense of democracy. Person-to-person. It's been atomized. Meaning has been atomized. And so we need to start there, right? Come back. So I'm just going to quickly go through what happened, because we have to define what the problem is before we find the right way forward, right? How did it change us? Because it did. And then the third is, we can do something about it. You're doing something about it, right? We must do something about it. And the question that we have asked each other, the journalists in this room, the officials who are here helping us in the fight, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? You heard me say this in the Nobel lecture. Starting in 2018, studies showed that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts. If you don't have facts, you don't have truth. You don't have truth, you don't have trust. Without trust, you don't have anything. We don't have a shared reality. How do we begin to solve the problems that we have? Climate change stories, they get the lowest distribution. Anyway, let me go through. So this is our crucial question. How do we rebuild trust? Because we must. It's what illiberal governments have destroyed. It's what increasing the rise of fascist leaders, and I don't use that word lightly. And for us in Rappler a decade ago, we had 3 pillars, and those are going to be the same 3 pillars we're going to look to for solutions. Tech. Sorry, I didn't mean to scream out tech if you're from tech, but it's really your fault. So, tech, journalism, and community. Right? And I'll go through each one of these. In order to fight tech, you need tech. And we journalists haven't embraced it enough. This is from a book by Sinan Aral, published in 2019. He's a professor at MIT. He, along with Deb Roy, did the study that showed lies spread 6 to 7 times faster than those really boring facts that journalists do. We spend our careers learning how to tell stories to keep your attention, but it doesn't matter because we're fighting against really salacious conspiracy theories, hate, us against them. Anyway, let's go through, right? Let's go to the technology trifecta, and I need my cell phone here because every one of you has a cell phone, right? What's here, every app that you have is collecting your data. So this is your medium. Right? And what does that mean when they collect your data? Let's just use my favorite, Facebook. We're frenemies. We're partners. We're fact-checking partners, only one of 2 in the Philippines of Facebook, right? If I was the truest of true believers when I started Rappler, it would have been 2012 when we started the website. So what happens is the smartphone is your medium, right? And the digital social networks gathers. You each load the app, and here's what happens. For every atomized post that you do, you're going to post the video that you have, machine learning comes in and builds a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself. Another word for it is your clone, right? And it knows you better than you know yourself. Then what happens is artificial intelligence comes in and pulls it all up to the business model, something Shoshana Zuboff called surveillance capitalism. That's the data trove. And that data trove then powers the operating system, what we call algorithms of amplification. This is not a freedom of speech issue, which is what many would like to have you believe it is. It's a freedom of reach issue. And I'm quoting a comedian when I say that, Sacha Baron Cohen, freedom of distribution. It's the distribution of the lies, that's the problem. All right, so what happens then? Here are the trends on the side. Personalized mass persuasion. It's very personal. Your feed is different from my feed, is different from your feed. And only the person or group attacked actually sees all the attacks. So if you're a researcher, it's really a blessing to be attacked because you see the data, right? Personalized mass persuasion, hyper-socialization. Is anyone ever alone anymore? Which is, being alone is where leadership begins, right? You have to make those decisions. And then the third is tyranny of trends. Let's go to the solution on the left. These are where we find them: money, code, norms, and laws. Money, the business model. Change the business model. Surveillance capitalism, and I'll show you in the next slide how the EU is taking actually some of the best legislation that we have existing now is kicking in spring next year, too late for us who have elections this year. Code. You built a building, right? Shouldn't there be building codes? These are buildings in our minds. Why are our minds not protected? Norms. Anger, hate, conspiracy theories. The worst of humanity is being created. Emergent human behavior. There are new norms of the worst of who we are. You have to still believe in the goodness of human nature. And then finally, the fourth, laws. The Democracy Action Plan of the EU. Germany was among the first to come out with a law, and we're looking forward to the DSA, the DMA, right? Again, too late. There are 30 plus countries having elections this year. If you don't have if you don't have integrity of facts, we don't, how can you have integrity of elections? That's a crucial question, right? Okay, so here's the problem. We have new gatekeepers starting in 2014. Not surprisingly, where did we really see the emergent realities, the different realities? The invasion of Crimea, annexation of Crimea. 8 years later, even after Ukraine came to the platforms to tell them the problem, 8 years later, Russia invades Ukraine. And we have journalists trying to hold the line. Here's what's happened. The content was separated from distribution. Deutsche Welle, you are so lucky because you still have distribution, but your network distribution isn't as powerful as the networks of social. Lies spread faster than facts. And here's the last part. This is now a behavior modification system. Some great studies, I'll tweet it, that talk about us against them, in-group versus out-group. Let's use another word for it, replacement theory. That's another word for us versus them, right? And where does this go? Most of the tech platforms will tell you the problem is in content moderation. Don't believe that, because that's downstream. You have to move further upstream to the algorithms of amplification. That's the operating system of our information ecosystem, and then go all the way upstream to the business models, surveillance capitalism. That's where our data is. And 4 things come together in that, right? When you're talking legislation, antitrust, data privacy. Do you have the right to your personal thoughts, or just because they cloned you with machine learning, is that theirs? These are crucial questions. User safety, who's in charge? Why is it that when I'm in the US and I slip on snow in front of someone's home, they're liable? But in our minds, it's okay for someone to pound us relentlessly, astroturf our brains, and change the way we look at the world, change our values. And then the last is content moderation. Sorry, I'm emotional. Let me, I will go faster. So this is how we discovered it. 2016, this was the weaponization of the internet series. I wrote 2 of the 3. The third one was really interesting because we showed that 26 fake accounts can ripple to more than 3 million others. This is the network that spread the lies. The first wave, we're up in our 9th or 10th wave already because it's been 6 years. And the dots are Facebook pages, and this was the first one where they built influence, where they replaced journalists with, quote, influencers. Please don't ever call a journalist an influencer. It's the worst insult. Journalism requires a little more courage, and we can't lie, because if we do, we're legally liable. This is some of the things that happened after, and this network spread it. These are, I'm going to share with you, please don't tweet them, but you can, I guess, it's up to you. I'm going to share with you, don't eat or drink anything in the next few minutes. So, cave person, yes, these are some of the memes. It's memetic warfare. When I was convicted, this came out because there was a reaction in the conviction. I'm appealing this case. You can see I have very dry skin, eczema. And if I don't eat, sleep, or am under stress, all in journalism, my skin gets worse. So what did they do? They called me scrotum face. They had things like this pop out. I wake up to this. I go to sleep. And you get angry. But you, as a good journalist, push it down. You must. And they became even more creative when the film came out. Again, you can see what they did to my skin, but then scrotum face pops out again. It's quite creative, isn't it? And then we have the conviction. Because in the end, like in Ukraine, the meta-narrative is seeded years earlier, and the methodology is the same. Pound and suppress, and then replace. So the meta-narrative in our case is journalist equals criminal. On June 15th, 2020, a colleague and I were convicted for cyber libel. A story I didn't write, editor supervise, that was published at a time when the law we supposedly violated didn't even exist. And yet here we are, right? So I will fight because I have to believe in the rule of law. But this is the core problem. When you don't have rule of law in the virtual world, you won't have rule of law or the checks and balances of any democracy in the real world. Why? Because we only live in one world. Our minds are the same, right? So it's kind of, we need rule of law in the virtual world. This is what the New York Times said after. You say a lie 1,000,000 times, it becomes fact. That's also a fact. So when people believe the lies, this is part of our problem with last night's panel. When people believe the lies, is it their fault or yours as a journalist? It's not our fault as journalists. This is a study done last year by UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists. Women, we are back in the Stone Age. Big data case study, so they took almost 500,000 attacks against me. It was so bad that I was at one point getting 90 hate messages per hour. These are ICFJ studies. 73% of women journalists experienced online abuse. 25% received threats of physical violence, and 20% were actually attacked. Women politicians are facing similar things, and many women are opting out, right? So here's the nature of the attacks against me. 60% were meant to tear down my credibility. I've been around a long time. This is my 36th year as a journalist. Thank God it didn't really work, but for a group of people, it did. They believe I'm a criminal. 40%, that's the part that's hardest. That's meant to tear your will down. That's meant to suppress and repress, so you opt out. Why do we do this to ourselves, right? Well, here's where I pull it up to today, and this was part of our panel last night. It's what trust is in the age of information warfare, right? You have to define it, because if you don't, you make mistakes like this. Let me show you what happened. This came out this week, right? And this is what happened to the Philippines. Lorraine Bedoy is a government official who is using McCarthyism tactics against journalists, human rights activists, and and opposition politicians. This graphic that comes from data that I believe are more vanity metrics is now used to attack us. And again, they go back. And again, I smile a lot. And again, here's the real world impact. Well, one of the government influencers doxes us, and we have to increase our security. That's real. And our board director, a former cabinet secretary, was kicked out of the Philippine Daily Inquirer, which is the newspaper where she's been a columnist for decades. She's been on our board for 4 years, but it's a great excuse to use. Let me bring you to the United States, where the meta-narrative. So I'll end with the DNR with just, let's read it. Let's define what trust is. Don't give a loaded pistol against journalists already under attack, because it is the same in Brazil, India, Hungary, in many, Oxford's Internet Computational Propaganda Research Project actually said that as of January 2021, cheap armies on social media rolled back democracy in more than 80 countries around the world. That means you have to redefine trust. Actually, I think that includes, no, it doesn't include Germany. So, all right, let's look at the US. This is from the Election Integrity Partnership. Stop the Steal, which, where's Patricia? It's already happening in Brazil now, courtesy YouTube. That's where they're seeding it, right? So Stop the Steal in the US was pushed into the meta-narrative, was pushed as a meta-narrative August 2019, a year later. And then it mainstreamed with Steve Bannon on YouTube, and then Tucker Carlson took it further in September of 2020, and by October, QAnon drops it. And then, of course, President Trump comes top down in November. That's how you had violence on Capitol Hill. First time it's ever happened. Now I want to show you quickly, what can we do, right? This is after I come back from the Nobel, from Oslo, which was, thank you, Norway. Thank you. You know, when we came back, I noticed I was getting attacked a lot more, because you don't have to tell the truth. In fact, telling the truth for a government right now works against you. What kind of incentives are these, right? So this is what my Twitter account looked like. Those are attacks. So we just pulled down the data. And we began to look at the creation dates of the Twitter feed, right? And then we began to look at kind of the pro-Marcos versus anti-Marcos, and when those accounts were created. That's the gray is when the anti-Marcos accounts were created, and the red is when the pro-Marcos accounts were created. That's an information operation, so we did a story on it. And within a few days, Twitter took it down. They can and they do, right? So here we go. How do we rebuild trust? And here's where I'll give you the solutions. I hope, because that's what we're working towards. Tech, legislation. So the long term, of course, is education, legislation, thank you. It's taken too long because as tech abdicated responsibility, so did governments. You left us alone a little too long. Please kick in. We also decided to build our own platform for community. We call it Lighthouse. And it's working. I'll show that to you later. Journalism is the second one, right? What did we do before the Nobel? I decided, before the Nobel was announced, I agreed to co-chair the International Fund for Public Interest Media. Western news organizations are luckier than those in the global south, than those in Southeast Asia. So the International Fund for Public Interest Media is asking governments, democratic states, to push more than 0.3% of ODA, overseas development assistance, to journalism. You need us at this point in time. You need us to keep doing our jobs, and the business model is dead, right? Third, community. And this is where, and this is, I think, where you can say we must be more creative and innovative, and I'll show you what we did in the Philippine elections. I'm going to show you 2 slides I don't show to large groups, but I will because it was 2020. Because there's hope. I run the business of Rappler, and you can take a look. You can see that the attacks of the government, which were bottom-up astroturfing and then legal cases top-down in the real world, it means I can still go to jail for the rest of my life. But that's okay, we'll keep doing our jobs. But here, I can quantify for you. This is money, and you can see that the government's attacks only cost us 3 years, right? And you can see how much it costs us, roughly $5.6 million to operate. But here's where, for news heads, you must be innovative, is the red is advertising. Look at how it's dropped, right? Because the very platforms that are manipulating us insidiously are also the ones that are micro-targeting and getting the advertising, because journalists don't micro-target to that degree. So look at how our advertising bottomed out. In 2018, in January 2018, when the Philippine government tried to take away our license to operate, within 4 months, we dropped 49% of our advertising revenue. We should have gone bankrupt by 2018. But what it did do, and this is where I would say, what Nietzsche was right, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. What we were forced to do was come up with a sustainable business model based on data and tech. That's the green. And in the first year, 2018 to 2019, that's a growth of 2,000%. And when the pandemic hit, we hired people that the other news groups were letting go of, right? We had 5 years of turning crisis into opportunity. All of us are in crisis, not just Ukraine. Ukraine is clear, you're at war. Although Russians may not think so. No, joke. Hi, Mikhail. All of us are at war right now. Sorry. All right, so here's the community part. Now, end with this. This is what we did in the Philippines, and it was a little, too late. Partly the Nobel got in the way, but that's a good thing. We were supposed to start this in November. We started it in January and really got it off the ground in February. A whole of society approach. We need to pull our communities together. So for the very first time, we had 16 news groups come together, literally link to each other, share each other, fact checks. They don't spread as far and wide as the lies. So what did we do? Our mesh, second layer, civil society, the church, businesses, finally, they came in and they shared the fact checks with emotions. Thinking fast, thinking slow, right? We journalists stay away from the emotions, but that's how you get distribution. The mesh worked. The third layer, research. We pulled together 7 research groups, including ours, and every week we came out with, this is how you are being manipulated this week. This is who is winning. This is who is benefiting from it, and this is who's being attacked. And finally, the last layer is the most important one, rule of law. The lawyers finally came in, and they were the most active. Because those journalists were really tired, but the lawyers were really invigorated. And they came in, and they did both tactical and strategic litigation. Within the first 2 weeks of this FactsFirstPH pyramid, the Solicitor General filed a petition at the Supreme Court against fact-checking, calling it prior restraint. It's not. But it shows you it works. But it wasn't enough. If you have elections, do this at least 6 months before your next one. I put it all together in this book that's coming out. We are at an existential moment, and we must work together. We must define the problem, and it will require all of us to protect democracy and to prevent the rise of fascism. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much for that presentation. I will open the floor for questions, but I'd like to start by just finding out, you said what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but how? Because that's a lot for one person to deal with consistently.
I think there's so many wonderfully brave journalists in this room, right? So how do you do it? You know that, I think Anthony Fauci, this is a once in a century moment. I think that's the way it is. In the Nobel lecture, I said an atom bomb exploded in our information ecosystem. And how did I looked at the data, facts, and I knew we were being manipulated, and I guess call me crazy, but I felt like I had spent 36 years going to the gym for this moment. And we're not alone. You're all here. So
The community that you're talking about.
I think this is a global community, right? Please don't make the mistake of thinking this is just in the Philippines or in Brazil, which has elections in October, or in Kenya, which has elections in August. India. Oh, you have elections. So India is next year. Indonesia is next year. If we elect illiberal leaders, governments are going to have to deal with this, right? There's a balance of power in the world that is shifting in front of our eyes. So my problems are nothing compared to the world's problems.
Well, we thank you for taking on those challenges on behalf of the profession. Now, if you have a question, please raise your hand. There's a microphone that will be brought to you. We've got one here already. Try and be as brief as possible. Yeah, you've got one? No questions? We've got a question at the back there. As we wait for the microphone to get to her, perhaps in talking about communities, I often think of social media. And you did say actually in your speech in Oslo that tech is engaging in this behavior modification system that you repeated here, in which we are Pavlov's dogs being experimented on in real time. But we're existing in that same space as media houses. And Rappler has 3-point-something million followers on Twitter. How do you reconcile these two worlds and philosophies?
We're building a tech platform, right? That's one. So please, who was it? In last night's panel, it's like, this is a temporary thing. If we stay in social media, if social media isn't given guardrails by governments, then only the worst of journalism will survive. These tech platforms are choosing which organizations survive, which news organizations survive. And they're not investigative journalism. They're not climate change stories. These don't get any distribution, right? So I guess the short answer to that is don't become a surveillance capitalism news organization. That's one. Do you know what I mean when I say that? It's like we have to push back, which is why I called out the DNR, because you cannot fall into the trap. We fell into the trap by giving our relationships, by putting a share button on each of our sites. We all did that, right? Because they're the world's largest distribution platform for news. That's Facebook. YouTube has played large roles in each of our countries. It's now #1 in the Philippines. Sorry, the direct answer to your question is that we must use tech to control our own destiny. We cannot manipulate to the worst of human nature.
Right.
I refuse to do that.
Okay. Let's get the question real quick. Please tell us your name and where you're from.
I know her.
Thank you.
Suhasini Haider. Go.
I'm Suhasini Haider. I'm here from India and an old fan and a friend of Maria's. But Maria, I do want to ask this in front of an audience and a community of journalists, that in the past, perhaps, journalists' real fight was against authorities, was holding truth to power, holding governments accountable. Today, that's spread out because not only are journalists protecting themselves from the backlash from authorities, but it's also the backlash from a public that is losing faith in journalism, sees everything as fake news, and most importantly, from other journalists who are willing to take the stated line and in a sense undermine the credibility of their own. So what would you say really we need to do to make the community of journalists stand up for each other?
Thank you. Thanks, Suhasini. Suhasini actually helped me learn India more than 30 years ago. Look, I think you have to go to the core of the problem. Don't look at it's kind of like if the root cause is coronavirus, but you're treating the symptoms, not the actual virus. And what's the root cause of that? Part of the reason our communities are being turned against us is because of information warfare. That's where you guys are, but for us, it's information operations. It is documented. I worry about the United States. I worry about democratic countries all around the world. So what do? Do you go to your public and ask them what they want and give them what they want, even if they believe that a Marcos win will mean that they will get gold in exchange for voting for him? That's a lie, but it was on YouTube and it spread on Facebook. And many Filipinos believe that. So chicken or the egg, right? And I believe journalists are the core. There's a reason why we were targeted, guys. We were targeted because if you can tear down the credibility of a news organization, if you can make your public doubt everything, then the autocrat wins. Putin knows this very well.
And we'll be speaking to him actually in a session that's coming right up. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for you, Maria. Thank you so much for your presentation and for being here with us.